Hello, good morning. I'm Rui Monteiro, a senior PPP specialist at the World Bank. Today, we will be discussing the fiscal management of PPP commitments and PPP risks. The idea is having a short presentation and then gather your comments and have a debate on this topic. The goal is discussing the importance of fiscal management for PPPs. So the idea is discussing how the finance ministries should prepare for PPPs and should manage the PPP process, not on a project-by-project basis, but as a portfolio. So looking for the global implications, global fiscal implications of PPPs. We will briefly discuss public infrastructure, PPPs, the role of fiscal management, trying to understand the need for understanding the infrastructure and PPP risks. We will discuss a bit direct costs and contingent liabilities, including implicit liabilities, and the role of budgeting and reporting on all these. So we will be building on the global experience on PPPs and on the difficulties that some countries are facing on starting their PPP programs or containing or getting efficiency out of their PPP programs. As you all know, public infrastructure is highly relevant for growth and for the quality of life of populations. Infrastructure has a few characteristics. One of them is the long economic life. So roads, buildings, or tunnels, whatever, they will be there. Once they are built, they will stay for a while, typically for a term of life that is higher than the terms of life of governments. So they will spend several governments, several legislators, and all that infrastructure has typically a sunk cost. That means that if you build something, the alternative uses will be scarce. So you will typically need to have that infrastructure only for that purpose and for no other. So when public funds are used for that project, we need to be very careful because we cannot divert the money or the asset to other purposes, and the asset will be there for a long time. In general, PPPs have specific design. So for a bridge or a tunnel, you cannot take a design off the shelf. You need to have teams working on that specific project. That means that benchmarking will not be easy, and the complexity of procurement is also higher because you are doing something very specific. Of course, for some projects, you can have more standardized approaches for basic healthcare facilities or for schools. You can standardize somehow infrastructure. But of course, for roads, tunnels, you cannot do that. Public infrastructure is affected by a set of issues. So we are fully aware of all the issues related to cost overruns, completion delays, poor design, poor maintenance, poor project selection, or corruption issues surrounding infrastructure. PPPs can help us solve some of those issues, but due to the complexity of procurement, they could create additional issues. And also because PPPs create a long-term commitment by public and private sector around some piece of infrastructure they will be there for a long while. So managing not only the current implications but the future implications of PPPs is critical, and fiscal implications are relevant here. We want PPPs to bring this credible incentive for completion of the infrastructure, some optimization of design, guaranteed maintenance, effective delivery of service to users. But for that, we need to have a framework in place, some institutional framework in place for governments to manage this. The results we have from PPPs all around the world shows that many countries are seeing the good results out of their PPP projects, but we are also seeing countries that are struggling to start their PPP programs. And they need to create the conditions for having those projects taking off. And part of that deals with having a fiscal management structure for that, a framework in place, and that gives credibility to the program. Other countries were able to start their PPP programs, but they are obtaining effectiveness, but they are not obtaining the efficiency they were looking for when they started the programs. One of the main issues is renegotiation. So creating teams in government, in the finance ministries, that are able to steer the process, and if not steering, at least controlling the process is really important. Other countries are not facing those efficiency issues, but they are facing affordability challenges. That means they engage in a volume of PPP projects that is higher than their fiscal ability to cope with those projects. So that the lesson from that is that we need to have a very good filtering mechanism when we are preparing the PPP projects and programs in order to guarantee their sustainability. We are seeing countries canceling contracts because they cannot afford them. So we need to be very careful in order not to waste money and use PPPs for the really important projects in each country. My purpose today is arguing that a proper fiscal management scheme for PPP and for PPP commitments and PPP risks is key for success. And it's not just, you could say, fiscal management is mainly for caring that we are not spending too much. Yes, but not only that, because if you have a proper fiscal management scheme in place, you will not only be caring for the overall volume of projects, you will be caring for the quality of the projects. And something we are seeing in some countries, and it's not a good practice, is having PPPs, is creating a scheme for PPP approval that bypasses the usual public infrastructure selection scheme. And we understand that countries need to have that, well, let's say, flexible scheme for advancing their PPP projects and programs. But they need to care for filtering those projects. If you create a special scheme for PPPs and you do not filter those projects, you do not assess them as you do for non-PPP projects, or even better than for non-PPP projects. If you do not filter them, if you do not assess them carefully in terms of costs, benefits, and risks, then you end up with the wrong set of projects. And we need to be careful that PPPs are a very effective way of procurement. And it means that once you sign the contract, you are launching a process, and it's a very powerful, effective process. And so you will have typically that infrastructure built. And then you will need to pay for it, or the users will have to pay for it. So you need to be very careful in guaranteeing that government and users, or both, they are able to sustain that project, and that project is really a priority project. So it needs to be a good project, it needs to be a priority, and it needs to be affordable. And for that you need some kind of fiscal management scheme in place. So you need a team in the finance ministry, a team that understands infrastructure and PPPs, and that has the ability, the technical ability the technical and also, let's say, the administrative, political ability to assess costs and risks and benefits, of course. You need to have some type of gateway process, allocating veto power to the finance ministry, even if the line ministry is in charge of the policy. So the goal is not to centralize the whole process in the finance ministry. So line ministries can still have, and they should still have, their role. They should be politically, they should be responsible for the project. But the finance minister needs to have some veto power at some phases in the project. And we need also some degree of transparent budgeting and reporting processes, typically following international standards. And this is an issue that we will probably discuss at depth, because there are some, well, in general, PPPs in many countries, they started in a strange way, so out of balance, and now there is this pressure, including coming from the new international standards, that say that PPPs should be in the books of government. And it's also a lesson from practice, is that it is much easier and safer to manage PPPs when they are reported and included in the government books. How can government create incentives for good project selection? Well, this is mainly a role of the line ministries. They should identify, assess, and select their best projects. But in the end, it will be responsibility of the Ministry of Finance or Planning Ministry, some central ministry and core minister. There will be that responsibility for balancing, trading off the different projects coming from different ministries, and select not only the best, but the priority projects, and checking that they are affordable. We need to have a process well established for identifying projects, assessing, selecting, prioritizing, checking affordability. There should be attention, and the lessons from the world experience show us that countries where there is a team preparing the projects, typically in line ministries or some agency, and a team assessing the projects in the Ministry of Finance, in a PPP unit or in some investment unit, public investment unit, that, let's say, tension between those teams, pushing for the project to go on and checking that the project makes sense in terms of public finance, that tension is critical. And that tension implies having someone in the finance ministry dealing with the fiscal management of public infrastructure. We are seeing many countries facing unsolicited proposals. Unsolicited proposals bring the private sector to the process with ideas not just for the project, but ideas for solutions. Well, of course, ideas for solutions should be and can easily be included in normal PPP procurement, because PPP procurement and PPP projects should not be too prescriptive. They should be focused on the outputs, on what government wants to have, preferably in terms of service delivered to the users. But unsolicited proposals also bring ideas on the projects themselves, not just on the solutions. So the private sector, when in countries where they are allowed to do so, they can bring ideas of new projects. And that is positive because it brings innovation and new ideas, a wide range of ideas. But it is also challenging because too much pressure from the private sector can bias, distort the selection process. And it can do it simply because the private sector will be, of course, by nature, focused on creating a nice project, good for the public interest, but also for the private interest. And of course, they will be focused on projects that are profitable for the private sector. I would say low risk, high benefit for the private sector. And the government may want the private sector to engage in other kind of projects with some additional risks or with lower volume or with higher volume, depending on the case. So government should have a very careful and of course intensive screening of those unsolicited proposals. There are countries, for instance, South Africa, where they feel that for unsolicited proposals, they need to do additional screening of those projects. And their practice says that they cannot rely on private proposals themselves. They need to do their independent assessment of those projects. So unsolicited proposals bring new ideas, but also new challenges to this process. And in general, you know that because PPPs bring a shift, a redesign of the structure of payments out of the short term that is normal under traditional procurement and into a long term. So PPPs allow for government to spread payments over time, but not only to spread, but also to shift payments into the future. So when in normal procurement you will start spending money when you start design for the infrastructure and then the construction. With PPPs, typically government will start paying after the completion of the infrastructure. So there is a shift that is not just a few years. In practice, decisions on PPP contracts are taking several years before the contract is signed. So that means that typically governments will be committing on procuring a project 5, 6, 7 years before the project is completed and government starts paying. So this means that the normal budgeting processes that government has, even the normal project selection processes, are changed by PPP procurement, because you will not include those projects in the budget. That is typically short term, 1 year or a few years more, and you will allow, in many cases, you will allow, if you don't have the proper fiscal management framework, you will allow line ministries to launch projects that were never budgeted. There was no appropriation for those projects because under normal budgetary rules, you don't need that. So you need to create something for PPPs. And we are seeing that more and more countries are realizing that. If we look for Europe, we are seeing that more and more countries are putting their projects into their budget. Some countries, for instance, the Netherlands or Germany, they are budgeting for all their projects, including PPP projects. And after a decision to have a certain project procured as a PPP, then they will redesign the budget in order to shift the flow of payments to the future according to the expected contract they will have. But that means that at the inception that they guarantee that they can afford those projects. Other countries such as the UK is the country in the world with the largest PPP program. So they have a very large volume of contracts by now. And they are very careful now in checking the affordability of their PPP projects. And they are, in fact, they are keeping a track of all those projects in the treasury. We know, and you can tell me, well, for all those countries, yes, Germany, Netherlands, UK, they are part of the European Union, and so their fiscal control is typically done using Eurostat rules, and Eurostat rules do not consider PPPs. Yes, it's a matter of fact. They do not. They have, for instance, in the UK, they assume they have this dual control. So for international reporting, they are using rules that still do not include PPPs there in government accounts. But for internal, and this is really my main concern, for their own governance, they include the PPPs in their accounts. And this is really important because we saw countries that engage in a large volume of infrastructure construction, some using intensively PPPs, case of UK, Portugal, others using PPPs but also state-owned enterprises, municipal budget, and so, for instance, Spain, with a vast number of projects, some of them now being closed or mothballed, or even contracts cancelled. So it's really important to avoid this misgovernance that rules that say that PPPs are outside the books of government create. How can government guarantee the affordability of its PPP projects and programs? Of course, governments can only guarantee affordability if they include those projects in their accounts and in their projections. And for that, we need to identify all the direct and indirect costs. So the costs that are going to that project, but also the costs that are going to other projects that are needed for that project to bring the results, the benefits that it is supposed to bring. We need to identify the contingent liabilities that are explicit in the contract, but also the ones that are not in the contract, but that exist, because launching a project creates expectations in the populations. And then we need some kind of sensitivity analysis. So looking for changes, and change will happen during the life of those contracts. Commercial change, but technological change, demographic change, and even political change. Governments change their mind, and we need to be aware of the cost of a change in policy. And we need to do this exercise, and ministries of finance should do that exercise, not just for each project, but also for the whole portfolio, the PPP portfolio, and I would say for the whole infrastructure portfolio. Why? Well, because some of the risks that exist, some of those risks are correlated. So it means that if you have, for instance, a sudden reduction in GDP for a few years, or a reduction in the rate of growth, that will affect, for instance, traffic in every road. That can affect also demand for certain other services. So you need to do those those exercises, those risk evaluation and sensitivity analysis exercises for those projects. Some countries are doing that exercise for some risks. For instance, Chile has been doing that for many years for their roads, and not only. You can see their airports, other projects, in which for which they feel that they can face significant risks. And as a matter of fact, Chile is paying each year claims regarding some guarantees that they provided to few contracts. So it's not just an expectation, it's a reality. Chile, Korea are paying compensation to some operators. And you know that this happens for different reasons. Could be lack of traffic, in other cases could be foreign exchange issues. That depends, of course, on the contracts. So the role of the fiscal management scheme is not just to monitor the risks, but also to assess the risks at the inception and design the contracts and the projects in order to minimize the risks, or at least to trade off those risks and costs, because in some cases we need to accept some risks in order to reduce costs. How can government reach efficiency protecting the interests of the taxpayer? As I was telling you, it's not just an issue of affordability. If you are assessing the costs, benefits, and risks of the projects carefully, then you will also improving the efficiency of public investment. And we are seeing countries, we see that the countries that have better control on all that are countries where there is what we call a gateway process. That means simply that at certain phases in the process, so before the project is approved, before the project goes for procurement with all the documents prepared, before the private sector partner is awarded the contract, before all that, the finance ministry needs to assess the project or the contract, and the finance minister needs to decide on that. So this brings the fiscal responsibility of the finance ministries in the PPP process. And also, and this is really important, before and during each renegotiation process, the finance ministry is brought into the process. We are seeing not only that countries are adopting gateway processes like this, formal processes, bringing the ministry and the minister of finance into the process, but we are seeing that even some countries are transferring some additional power to the ministers of finance. So that means that some of those finance ministry or treasury units are having more power than before. We are seeing that in developed countries, France, UK, Portugal, but we are seeing that also in developing countries. The need to have teams in the finance ministry with responsibility for the process, and the need to train those teams is recognizing. Countries that are starting now PPP programs, such as Uruguay, are designing their institutions in such a way. So, bringing the finance ministry into the process in a clear, even formal way. Shall the government account for PPP costs and risks? Well, as I told you, when this PPP wave started some 15 years ago in Europe, Europe created that rule, that Eurostat rule, saying that, well, if PPPs are really transferring some significant risks to the private sector, PPPs should not be accounted for in government books. And that, I believe, it created significant distortions. As a matter of fact, it put PPPs in a certain limbo because the private sector was not putting them in their accounts because of the standards they were using. And the public sector was also not considering them. Now we have a different framework, because now we have the new IPSAS, the new standards for public accounting that say that PPPs should be in the books of government. And of course, some countries are facing this as a challenge, and it is. That means that governments should include the investment coming out of PPPs in their books. In the stricto sensu of IPSAS 32, the standard related to this, even projects where government is not spending money, projects that are paid by the users, should be recognized in the books of government. For me, the main point is not, shall we use IPSAS 32 or not? Well, we advise governments to use as much as possible international standards. But the real point is guaranteeing that governments are recognizing the full extent of future costs that they are engaging when they sign PPP contracts. And that governments are also recognizing the risks that they are accepting by signing PPP contracts. And this is really important, because if governments are avoiding the recognition of costs and risks, they are sending a signal to the market that they are not really guaranteeing the ability of government to satisfy their commitments with the private sector. So it is really important for PPP programs to start in the best way if we guarantee that governments are reporting on those projects. That means at least that the costs that government expectedly will have with PPPs will be recognized in the budget. And you would say, but the budget is typically a one-year exercise. Yes. So that means that we will have to report somehow the future costs of those projects. And it's really important to recognize PPP the future commitments of government, fiscal commitments on PPPs, to recognize them as something that government will have to pay. So it seems it is similar to public debt. It's not public debt, but it is equivalent, because if government is really willing to have those projects, government needs to be prepared to pay for them. So we have, on the one hand, the need for developing some long-term budgeting schemes for PPPs, and governments typically are using memos attached to the budget, presenting all those commitments. The British have this spreadsheet with all their projects and the expected cost of each project in the future. This is, for most countries, it will not be a large spreadsheet, but it is, well, a row of costs year on year related to PPPs. Of course, implementing those rules is important for having transparency on the cost of those PPPs. But of course, we cannot and should not have a scheme that creates biases against PPPs. So a scheme that benefits state-owned enterprises against PPPs, because state-owned enterprises are considered commercial and PPPs not, should be avoided. Schemes that create biases against user fee projects should also be avoided. avoid it. If the project is expected to be paid by user fees, we should recognize that in that in those projection of public accounts. So we should recognize the costs of the PPPs, but also the expected income that will come from user fees, and also somehow look for the risks and look for, well, and have in mind that out of those risks created by PPPs, some of them will actually happen. So you will need to be prepared for that, as the Chileans are doing with that exercise. And what is really important is to avoid illusions regarding fiscal space creation. PPPs per se do not create fiscal space. What creates fiscal space is the efficiency of PPPs. So if you focus too much on PPPs as a way for creating fiscal space, in the end you will lose the efficiency and you will have no fiscal space. Of course, user fee projects themselves, they typically create fiscal space. But PPPs can be done with or without user fees, and user fee projects can be delivered with or without PPPs. So we should be very careful in distinguishing one from the other. IPSA 32 is helping, yes. IPSA 32 is helping because it created actually a new standard. In the end, we should look for that as the reference. Are countries prepared to implement IPSA 32 now? Well, the full appliance of IPSA 32 will imply a different perception regarding fiscal space itself. Of course, PPPs are bringing to the process credibility in the implementation of the project, so effectiveness of the project, and some expectations regarding the efficiency of the project. Expectations that are, of course, conditional on the quality of the project, on the quality of the contract, and on the quality of procurement, and on the quality of contract management after the contract is awarded. But it is really important to have in mind that in the future we should look for PPPs as projects that, even if they do not create costs for government, they create fiscal risks. And we saw that in Mexico some years ago. We are seeing now it in Spain. Even user fee-based projects, they can collapse and they can create risks and costs for governments. So we need to be careful in appraising the whole portfolio of PPPs. And we need to have those teams in place, those rules in place. The most important is guaranteeing that governments are not looking to the other side. Governments are facing the reality of costs, benefits, and risks when they sign PPP contracts. And for that, we need to have those teams fully capacitated in the Ministries of Finance. We need to have those processes that give the Finance Minister some role on the process based on the assessments done by that team. And we need to have, well, some reporting rules on those projects for government to be fully aware of the costs and risks of those projects, and also the benefits, of course. So I know that IPSA 32 is creating issues in some countries, but I'm seeing also that some countries, starting from a difficult debate on IPSA 32, were able to create, and in some cases they've been negotiating with the International Monetary Fund and other multilaterals. They've been agreeing on some improvements in their budgeting and reporting schemes. And I'm glad to see that move for improvement, even if it means facing the realities of costs that infrastructure, of course, will bring to the process. We cannot deliver the service without assuming the costs and risks of building infrastructure. So I will be glad to have a debate. I see that we are now having a set of questions. I have the help of John Saville here with me, and John has been collecting a few questions, so we can start this process. Thank you.
So about fiscal risk, how we can manage it, specifically in relation to contingent liabilities.
Yeah. Well, the question relates to contingent liabilities, how to manage contingent liabilities. Well, I showed you the example of Chile. In the case of Chile, they have this report on contingent liabilities for many years. And it is an annual report on contingencies coming out of the contracts. In this case, in the case of Chile, government accepted for a few projects. I suppose it's not the standard now, but they accepted to provide some guarantees on demand for a few projects. The same happened in the past in Korea, and it is creating well, a significant volume of transfers from government to the private providers each year. In the case of Chile, they do simulations. So what they do is a Monte Carlo simulation on their projects in order to have a good estimate on the transfers that government will need to make to those private operators. We know that this exercise should be part of a more global exercise on contingent liabilities, and the Chilean report is not only dealing with PPPs, they deal with other contingent liabilities. But the point is the need to look at least for those contractual contingencies. But we know that the exercise should be larger than that. Government should always be aware of the cost of changes in policy. Not only, I wouldn't say not only changes in policy, the cost of, well, developments of the public policy. Roads in a certain way are more protected from that than other projects, but clearly hospital projects are projects that are significantly affected by, I would say, developments in public policy. So changes in the range of services that is being provided to the users can have a fiscal impact. So government should be aware of that. There is an exercise that I'm keen to look for, and I invite you also to gather information on that. But in Rio de Janeiro, in Brazil, there are now rules that say that for each PPP project, the project team should present and publish a list of the risks that can affect the project, and also an estimate of the marginal impact of each of those risks. And they should also present a few scenarios related to that risk and the cost of each scenario. So the cost of the contingencies for each scenario. This is an interesting exercise because it will force people that are preparing the projects to look for all those contingencies that come with the project. We know that some contingencies are not explicitly presented in the contract, but they exist. The example is what is happening now in Madrid with all the radiales, with the highways that connect the suburbs to the city center, with demand below the initial expectation. And so a strong pressure by the private sector to have the government, well, rescuing them somehow. and government is saying that, well, we will not go beyond the legal commitments we have, but within our legal framework, we will try to solve the issues. And we saw what happened some years ago in Mexico. So we can have ways for protecting our contracts better or less better against those risks. But really, having teams looking for those risks will help government protect government itself, but also protect the private sector against the assumption of risks that government or private entities cannot cope with. So this is really important. I was saying that some risks are really implicit. Some contingencies are implicit contingencies. And some of them deal with change in policy. And of course, we cannot ask government to present a report on the fiscal implications of changes in public policy, but they happen. And so it is important that government and also the opposition knows the cost of changes in policy. It helps create stability. And it helps also having PPPs focus on projects that are really important, not just for the current government, but for future governments. So projects that cannot be easily disbanded. I just yesterday received the notice that the government of France is now buying back one of their PPP hospitals. The contract was signed a few years ago. The hospital was completed a few years ago, but they have difficulties in managing the contract and in having the PPP cope with the evolution, with the normal evolution in health policy. That is the kind of change that we change to the contract, to the project, that we should avoid. And the best way is to have a good assessment of all the implications of the project from the inception. And having, of course, not only the health ministry, but also the finance ministry looking for those projects as long-term projects that lock public and private sector for long term. Yeah.
Okay, so portfolio analysis are difficult and complex. So what would be the impact of such analysis on the cost of governance, and what about systematic risks that are generated through large portfolios of PPPs?
Yeah, we know, I just present, so the question relates to the systematic risk and how can we deal and assess that risk. I gave you the example of traffic demand in a situation of low GDP growth or even negative GDP growth and the impact on traffic. And this is an issue. Well, this is probably one of the easiest cases because it's simply look for the portfolio of roads and check the simultaneous impact of a decrease in traffic demand in those roads. So one of the ways is looking for different scenarios. And I suppose it's better to look for the scenarios than looking for some statistical measure of the risk involved in the project. Because if you look for the scenarios, you can, for instance, look for the worst case scenario and see how the private sector, is the private sector able to cope with those scenarios? Is the risk in the hands of government or in the hands of the private sector? Is the private sector able to cope? How will government cope with those contingencies? So it's really important to have, I wouldn't say to report on all that. Well, the Chileans just report on a few scenarios. Yes, and they even present some graphs with with different scenarios on traffic. Of course, I'm not inviting governments to publish the results on the worst case scenario, but it should be computed internally. Governments should be prepared to deal with different circumstances. It's not just putting the money. In many cases, it's creating mechanisms for the different stakeholders to cope with the situation. On measuring, of course, you have tools for Monte Carlo analysis. So the technical part is the easiest part. The political economy part is the trickiest one. How can we invite governments to really prepare for the contingencies and for managing the contingencies? That is the really important part. I've seen many countries where governments say, yes, we understand that PPPs will bring some contingencies, but my main concern now is launching the project, then I will deal with that. I would say that preparing from the inception for that, creating the institutions, that means the teams and the rules for that, that adds credibility to the project, to the process, improves project selection, and so in the end reduces the risks that governments face. So it helps them launch the projects, and at the same time helps them reduce the costs for the taxpayer in the future, and for the user that could be also affected. John?
Yeah. So I have a question. Do you think it's appropriate for a PPP expertise unit to be housed in the National Finance Ministry, or is this something that agencies themselves or local governments should be developing?
Well, the question on the structure, on how to structure the PPP teams is a difficult one. And it's difficult because in many countries, even in developed countries during the initial phases of PPP programs, capacity was scarce. So it was really difficult to have what we perceive that it is convenient to have. And it means having different teams, each one looking for different parts of the process and interacting between them in order to improve the project and the contract. So ideally, we should have a project development team and procurement team in the line ministries, and then having a team in the finance ministry or the planning ministry or so. I would say preferably the finance ministry, the treasury, looking for the projects from the viewpoint of the taxpayer and from the viewpoint of government as a whole. So comparing projects coming from different ministries and prioritizing them and checking the affordability. In practice, many governments cannot have these separate teams, and so they need to rely on a single PPP unit. There are countries where, for instance, in Chile, procurement is centralized in the Public Works Ministry that not only procures their own projects but also procure projects on behalf of other ministries. And they have a team in the Ministry of Finance caring for fiscal management. In South Africa, the National Treasury has the main PPP team, so the knowledge on PPPs is mainly in the National Treasury. And we are seeing that in developed countries, the trend is for those teams to move to the Finance Ministry, or at least for the Gravity Center to move there. We've seen that PUK, Partnerships UK, was incorporated in the Treasury. It's now Infrastructure UK. We've seen in France the MAP, the Central PPP Unit with reinforced powers. We've seen in Portugal the PPP unit in the Treasury having more responsibility, and now they are leading procurement of PPPs, while before line ministries were leading procurement and the PPP unit was just reviewing the projects and helping in procurement. So the responsibility is gradually moving from line ministries to central ministries. But it is important always to keep the policy, the responsibility for public policy in the hands of the line ministries, and responsibility for fiscal management in the hands of central government. We still have time for.
Yeah, we have lots of questions. I'll just give you a few. How do you deal with the risk, reducing the risk of long-term PPP contracts when you have administrations that are changing during this process?
Yeah, signing a long-term contract is well, we need to have it compatible with changes in government. We cannot, well, we should not refrain from having the normal process of government renewal just because we have long-term contracts. We need to adjust that, and the point is simply having better projects with better contracts. When I mean better projects, I mean projects that have a very high probability of being considered as priority projects by the current and future administrations. Better contracts mean contracts that are flexible enough to cope with some small, I wouldn't say changes, but evolutions in public policy, developments in public policy. And this is a main challenge when the contract deals, for instance, with social infrastructure. With transport or energy infrastructure, it's easier to have that the project insulated from public policy or changes in public policy, but it's not the same when we have social projects. But they could be very important for such social infrastructure, of course, PPPs.
Someone wants to know what is the significant rules of the IPSAS 32, not yet addressed in previous budgeting and control rules.
Well, IPSAS 32 say that all public investment, regardless of being paid by users or by government, should be registered in government books. Well, the main implication is that the capital investment for each project will be recorded as equivalent to public debt for government. So that is really a challenge, but it is simply it requires in the future, when IPSAS 32 are fully applied by every government, it requires a different perception of what is the long-term fiscal commitment of government, and having some classification of really the different components: public debt, really public debt, and PPP commitments. So it will be a process of gradual change, but that is the standard that we have now for public accounts. We are now at the end of this webinar. We still have lots of questions coming from different people. We will try to answer them by email. You have my email contacts here in my presentation. Well, not here, but you can simply email the World Bank Institute and they will send you my email address if you need some direct contact. I will try to answer directly your questions. Thank you for your participation. We will have another webinar on PPP contract management in the beginning of April. So just keep in touch with the Institute website, and we will have that webinar and a few more